In the lean years following the Second World War, a luxury car designer found himself stranded on a Welsh farm with a machine that refused to start. His solution was the Land Rover Series 1, a stopgap invention born in the mud of Anglesey that would accidentally save the company that built it and outlive everything else it made. To understand how, picture Maurice Wilks in 1947. He is a man used to fine leather and polished chrome, now crouching in farm boots beside a battered war surplus Jeep. The air smells of fuel and wet bracken as he runs a hand along a dented bonnet scratched down to bare metal. This machine has hauled, towed, and started every cold Welsh morning for years. But now it is dying, and on this entire island there is no replacement to be had. Wilks was staring at a problem no one in Britain had solved yet. The idea forming in that yard was the first breath of a machine that would outlive every elegant thing Rover ever hoped to build. And to see why, we have to look at the trap Britain had set for itself. What did post-war Britain actually look like? Britain came out of the Second World War technically on the winning side and practically broke. The country had spent 6 years burning through its reserves, borrowing from the Americans, and running its factories flat out for the war effort. By 1945, the debt was crushing, and the economy was held together with rationing and willpower. The government needed U.S. dollars, and it needed them fast. Steel was scarce, and the men in charge decided to use what little there was as a lever. But the steel famine was not just a shortage. It was a hidden rule built into the system, one that was effectively designed to let companies like Rover starve quietly while the government looked the other way. You have to look at the hard realities of 1945. The policy was straightforward. If you want steel, you export. Britain was effectively bankrupt and desperate for foreign currency. Steel going into a car for a British driveway did nothing for the national debt. So the government rewarded the exporters and starved everyone else. For Rover, this was a slow execution handed down on paper. They built expensive, conservative, luxury saloons that the export market did not want. While Rover's planned output was 20,000 cars a year, the steel they actually received was enough for roughly 1,100. They had a factory and a workforce, but the government had effectively told them they could only run at 5% capacity. But the steel famine was only half the trap. The other half was physical, and it sat in Solihull. Rover's original factory in Coventry was gone. German bombers had flattened it in 1940 and 1941, and the company had been moved into a government shadow factory, one of several purpose-built plants the British government had constructed before the war to quietly expand the country's industrial capacity without the Germans noticing. The Solihull plant had spent the war years building Bristol Hercules aircraft engines, the big engines that powered Britain's wartime bombers. The workers there knew aluminum. They knew precision. What they didn't know was how to make the kind of expensive, hand-finished, luxury saloon Rover had been known for, and starting that kind of production from scratch in a building never designed for it wasn't financially viable anyway. So by 1946, Rover had a half-empty factory full of aircraft engine workers, a steel allocation that barely covered 1,000 cars a year, and a product lineup the export market didn't want. The company had survived the war. It wasn't at all clear it was going to survive the peace. The man who would change that wasn't in Solihull. He was on a Welsh island, trying to keep a dying Jeep running. Maurice Wilks had taken the job of Rover's chief designer and technical director in 1946, and on paper, he was exactly what the company needed, a sharp engineering mind at the top of a company that desperately needed one. But Wilks wasn't the kind of designer who lived inside the office. He owned and worked a farm on the Isle of Anglesey, off the northwest coast of Wales, and he got his hands dirty there the same way any farmer did. His working tool on that farm was a war surplus Willys Jeep. The Willys had proven itself across every theater of the Second World War, North Africa, the Pacific, and the roads of liberated Europe. And when the war ended, thousands of them flooded into civilian life. Farmers across Britain picked them up cheap and put them straight to work. They were tough, simple, and capable in mud and rough ground in a way that nothing else affordable could match. Wilks had one, and he ran it hard. By 1947, it was nearly done. The frame was tired, the mechanicals were worn through, and finding parts was its own misery. Surplus Jeep components weren't being sold piece by piece, but in bulk lots. And new American Jeeps were not being exported to Britain at all. Wilks needed a replacement, and there wasn't one. Not on Anglesey, not anywhere in Britain. That frustration, by all accounts, cut deeper than inconvenience. The story passed down through the company is that Wilks reportedly felt if he could not build something better than an American Jeep, he had no business being in the car trade at all. That's characterization, but the feeling behind it rings true, because what he did next was not the move of a man looking for a workaround. It was the move of a man with something to prove. His brother Spencer was Rover's managing director, and the two of them effectively ran the company together. So, when Maurice brought an idea, it didn't have to fight its way up through layers of management. It got heard immediately by the one person with the authority to act on it. Company legend says the shape of the idea came together at Red Wharf Bay, a broad, shallow inlet on the east coast of Anglesey, where Maurice sketched the outline of what he was thinking in the wet sand and walked Spencer through it. Whether that's exactly how it happened or whether the beach has been romanticized over the years, nobody can say for certain, but the idea itself was real, and it was already formed. He wasn't thinking about a car. He wasn't even really thinking about a truck. He wanted one machine that could move people and cargo across rough ground, haul loads like a light truck, and do the work of a tractor in the field. A car, a truck, and a tractor in a single body. That ambition wasn't born in a design studio. It was born on a farm, from the specific gap left by a dying Jeep that nobody in Britain could replace. Built from scraps. The first problem Wilks had to solve wasn't engineering, it was material. Steel was rationed, so steel was the thing he'd build without. Wartime aircraft production had left Britain sitting on a surplus of aluminum with nowhere obvious to go. Rover's Solihull plant was already full of workers who'd spent the war forming aluminum into Bristol Hercules engine casings. Switching to vehicle body panels cost almost nothing in retraining or tooling. Wilks looked at what he had and built from it. That choice, made out of pure desperation, gave the vehicle something steel never could. Aluminum doesn't rust. Pack a steel body onto a wet Welsh hillside for 20 years, and it rots through. Do the same with aluminum, and the panels are still there. He chose aluminum because he had no alternative. What he gave the vehicle, without meaning to, was a permanence the car industry had never managed before. The aluminum body also shaped the entire look of the vehicle through the budget. Curved, sculpted panels need deep draw press dies, the heavy tooling the Shadow Factory didn't have. Commissioning them would have cost thousands of pounds before a single vehicle had been sold. So every surface was kept flat or bent in a single continuous curve, what engineers call a constant radius bend, the kind you can produce on a basic folding press the factory already owned. No compound curves, no expensive tooling. The body looked industrial because the budget demanded it. That constraint turned out to be an identity. The flat-paneled, purposeful shape that people came to associate with the Land Rover wasn't a design choice. It was a materials problem that became an icon. The chassis underneath came from the most obvious place available. Wilks took a Willys Jeep frame. The standard Jeep already ran an 80-inch wheelbase, and that dimension turned out to suit the new vehicle exactly. He bolted in the engine and gearbox from a Rover P3 saloon. The running gear they already made, already understood, already had spares for. Use what exists, waste nothing. The prototype was not built to impress anyone. It was built to find out if the idea worked. One detail on that first prototype sounds like a quirk, but was actually a calculated move. The steering wheel was mounted dead in the center of the cab, not on the left, not on the right, but right in the middle. They called it center steer. The logic was sound. Wilks wanted to sell this vehicle everywhere, and different markets drive on different sides of the road. One centrally steered prototype could serve as the basis for both left-hand and right-hand drive versions without building two separate test vehicles. It also put the driver in the same position as a tractor operator, surveying the ground ahead from the middle, not leaning toward one edge. In practice, center steer was more elegant in theory than in metal. The linkage mechanism proved too complex for production, and by the time the Series 1 launched, the wheel had moved to the conventional side. But the prototype still tells you exactly how Wilks was thinking. Not a car that could go off-road, but something closer to a tractor that also carried people. But the detail that makes the design philosophy undeniable is the power takeoff. To a car designer, an engine is for propulsion. To a farmer, it is a portable power plant. Wilks built the Land Rover with a power takeoff, a live drive shaft, capable of running a belt-driven saw, a water pump, or a thresher right there in the field. He was not building a car that could go off-road. He was building a mobile engine that could do the work of a stationary tractor, one that also happened to carry passengers and cargo. That single decision is the clearest possible statement of intent, and it is the reason the vehicle worked where everything else in its class eventually failed. Rover's board gave cautious approval in September 1947. They expected the thing to run 2 or 3 years, earn some export revenue, and quietly step aside once the P4 luxury saloon was ready to carry the company forward. Early production units were painted in surplus aircraft paint, a shade called cockpit green that the factory had sitting around in drums because it had nowhere else to go. It cost nothing, it looked purposeful, and it was exactly right for a vehicle that had been built in almost every detail from whatever happened to be on hand. On April 30th, 1948, Rover rolled roughly 50 pre-production vehicles into the Amsterdam Motor Show and waited to see what happened. The board had approved this thing reluctantly, painted it in leftover aircraft paint, and told themselves it would run a quiet 2-year course before the real cars took over. They were braced for a polite reception and a modest order book. What they got was the opposite. The orders came in faster than anyone at Solihull had planned for. Management had set a target of 5,000 for the first full year of sales, a figure that already felt optimistic inside the company. Demand buried it. The factory ran hard and still couldn't keep pace with what buyers wanted. From there, production climbed in a way that made the original 2-year plan look like a joke told in bad faith. Year on year, output climbed fast. By 1950, the factory was building around 16,000 a year. Not the modest little run of farm tools the board had imagined, not a stopgap quietly doing its job. Something else entirely. But the number that ended the argument, the one that turned into a quiet humiliation, for every man in that boardroom who had called this thing a stopgap, came in 1951. By that point, roughly 40,000 Land Rovers had been built. And in that same year, the vehicle Rover's board had designed to disappear was outselling Rover's road cars 2-1. Let that land for a second. The P4 Saloon, the car the board actually cared about, the refined, elegant machine that was supposed to carry Rover's reputation forward, the stopgap was outselling it at twice the rate. The farm tool was beating the masterpiece on its own turf, in the company's own production figures. Nobody had planned for that, and there was nothing left to argue about. By 1952, Solihull alone wasn't enough. Production had to be extended overseas just to meet demand, the vehicle spreading across export markets not because the government had forced it, but because buyers in those markets were asking for it by name. The Land Rover Series 1 earned the export allocation the steel rationing policy had demanded, not by building something the world politely accepted, but by building something the world actively wanted and couldn't get fast enough. The numbers were only the beginning, because if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on the machines that changed farming and industry. But what nobody at Rover's board had reckoned with yet was what happens when the thing you built to disappear refuses to go. Here's the quiet irony at the heart of this story. The decision that saved Rover from the steel famine, building the body out of aluminum because there was no other choice, turned out to be the reason these vehicles refused to die long after anyone expected them to. In 1992, Land Rover claimed that around 70% of all the vehicles the company had ever built were still in use. That figure came from Land Rover itself, so take it as a corporate claim rather than an independent audit, but even discounted, it points at something real. The flat panels hammered out on basic folding presses in a factory built for aircraft engines outlasted steel bodies rusting away in fields across the world. What nobody at Rover's board had planned for was what that longevity would do to the company's identity. The P4 Saloon, the car they'd actually cared about, came and went. The luxury cars that were supposed to define Rover's future had a good run and then aged out, as luxury cars do. The stopgap didn't age out. It evolved. Series 1 into Series 2 into Series 3 into Defender, and at every step it pulled more of the company's identity toward itself and away from the polished saloons that had started the whole argument. By the time anyone at Rover sat down to reckon with it honestly, the Land Rover wasn't funding the real product anymore. It was the real product. The vehicle assembled in over a dozen countries, adopted by armies and aid organizations and farmers on 6 continents, had created an entirely new category of vehicle, the civilian 4-wheel drive, practical and hard-roofed, and actually capable off a paved road where no category had existed before. Before Red Wharf Bay, that vehicle didn't exist. After it, manufacturers around the world eventually tried to build one. The Solihull factory that had stood nearly silent in 1946, its floor space echoing and its workforce waiting, ran full for decades, 2 shifts, then 3. The sound of aluminum being folded and frames being welded, replacing the roar of aircraft engines that had come before. The workers who'd shaped aluminum into Bristol Hercules engine casings during the war instead shaped it into Land Rover bodies and kept doing it for generations. The factory built for one war found its peacetime purpose on a Welsh farm. The original Defender line, the direct descendant of that first prototype with the center steering wheel and the iconic cockpit green, ran continuously until 2016. 68 years of production from a vehicle the board had given 2 or 3. It ended not because the design had failed, but because emissions regulations had finally caught up with an engine architecture that hadn't changed in principle since Maurice Wilks bolted a Rover P3 gearbox to a Jeep frame. The lineage that started with a center steering wheel and a borrowed Jeep frame finally rested on its own terms. The thing built to last 2 years outlasted the thing built to last forever. Wilks was not trying to create a legacy. He was trying to replace a dying Jeep and keep a factory alive. And what he built instead was the category manufacturers spent the next 7 decades trying to copy. Subscribe so you do not miss the next story of the machines that changed the world.